today. It's my honor to introduce Barbara Haeger, who Professor Haeger received her undergraduate degree from Tufts University and her master's and her doctoral degree from the University of Michigan. She subsequently taught at the University of Iowa before coming to Ohio State University and joining the Department of History of Art at Ohio State. Her research has been on the interpretation of specific religious subjects, focusing on exploring the pictorial construction of individual works of art and to engage the viewer to produce a meaningful experience. She's written a number of articles, published a number of chapters. Her most recent is Mary, Mother of God, Devotion and Doctrine in the Visual Arts from 1450 through 1700. I'm particularly interested in hearing this lecture. I was explaining to Professor Haeger, I just returned from a trip to Italy and in Bologna, where we were having a meeting about leukemia of all things, but we had a tour of the medical school, particularly the anatomy lab. And that had been used in the year 1200 to teach gross anatomy to the medical students. And above the dissection table, there was a huge mural of the Blessed Mother. And so I thought she probably would have been able to put much more meaning into that tour had she been with me. But so I'm looking forward to hearing her lecture today. And thank you for coming. Professor Haeger.
Thank you. And I want to thank Jackie Hunnick in particular, who's I need help. There. So thank you, and particularly thank you for Jackie Hunnick, who has came in with me yesterday to see if I could get this all up and running. Before I start, I just want to say something about the role of the viewer, which since the eminent historian Ernst Gombrich wrote decades ago, situating the relationship between the image and the viewer in something he called the beholder's share. And Jeffrey Hamburger has written, today the power of the image is located less exclusively in the image itself than in what Gombrich called the beholder's share, construed, however, largely in affective rather than purely perceptual terms. The way in which the works of art structure imaginative, religious, and even physical response, or at another level in which heightened artistic self-consciousness can in of itself elicit a corresponding self-consciousness in the viewer. Well, Rembrandt serves as a really good example of that heightened self-consciousness that elicits such a response in the viewer. And Rubens is a great example of someone who structures the viewer's response very particularly. Rubens knows exactly what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. And I think you can see in looking at that, I need to start my timer so I don't run over here. By fixing your presence in front of the painting. You look at the Rembrandt and you're not exactly sure where you are vis-a-vis the man who is Jan 6. You're in front of the Rubens and you know exactly where you are in front of that powerful torso fixed by that gaze. So I want to explore the Rubens in relation to our Rubens. This is in the Columbus Museum of Art, the work on the right, Christ Triumphant over Sin and Death. It's life-size, and it's too bad it's not in the galleries anymore. I don't know. I hope they're restoring it and not deciding it's not worth viewing. It is a collaborative work of Rubens in studio, but still it's a pretty magnificent painting. And the Ecce Homo, behold the man, is about 3 feet by 4 feet. So it's a very different image, and it doesn't situate you vis-a-vis Christ in quite the same way. But first, I need to say something about contemplating Christ, which is the whole aim of decades of Christian art. The aim being very much to work with visual images, your corporeal bodily sight, to go beyond that to what's termed spiritual sight, so you can see and eventually connect with God. Now, the subject that I'm dealing with the Rubens, the Ecce Homo, is closely related to the Man of Sorrows, which you see here. Oh, okay. I thought that was me doing something I wasn't aware of. Key part of the Christian tradition is to make you feel guilt, compassion for Christ, to get motivation for reforming your soul, for reforming the mirror, to polish, as it said, the mirror in your soul to reflect the image of Christ. So as you can see here, Christ is surrounded, bleeding, bloody, suffering, sorrowfully gazing at you, while the figures around him don't see him. So they make a good example of seeing with the mind's eye. The Virgin looks up, but you see her gaze is unfocused. But I better not get started on that. These two works from a 15th century manuscript make very explicit the role of the threshold in meditation and prayer in meditation. They're from the Hours of Mary of Burgundy, done toward the end of 1477. And I want to look first at this one, where you see the prayer book in the lower right, and you can see, I hope, the crucifixion there. In the 17th century, one of the writers, Antoine Souquet, writing about meditation, wrote that Saint Bonaventura, who wrote Meditations on the Life of Christ, instructed Thomas Aquinas, another great figure from the 13th century, on how to meditate using a crucifix to get one to see beyond to the figure of Christ itself. And you can see that the threshold very clearly indicated there with devotional objects. Mary of Burgundy herself is engaged with a particular prayer there, meditating on that actually begs for the Virgin's mercy. And you can see she has the threshold there, a window opened into the church, which was known as, at that time, the Church Triumphant was considered heaven on earth. And you see her there kneeling at the left, kneeling here, where you see the Virgin presenting Christ to her. So she has projected herself into the presence of Christ, and the opening of the windows there, I think, makes that emphatic. I'm showing you this work because the prayers on either side is Salve Regina, playing Save Us to the Queen of Heaven. And it, well, probably rather than paging way, oh yes, here. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee we cry, poor banished children of Eve. And then it goes on a bit, show us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. This pure banished children of Eve underscores that we are in the vale of tears, looking to the Virgin who presents Christ as a sacrificial object on the pillow. You can see that he's painted a little tassel over the frame to underscore a connectivity. And so you I think, very clearly get the sense that prayer opens a window to being in the presence of God. This is a diptych, a two-part panel in which Martin van Nieuwenhove, who's in the right wing, is shown praying toward the Virgin and Child. And I think you can see there clearly his eyes are unfocused. He's read the prayer, he is seeing with his spiritual sight, while we have the Christ child here, not presenting him an apple, but reaching up to take the apple from his mother to indicate he is the new Adam. He is going to take away the sin that Adam and Eve perpetrated by eating the fruit. But as he faces toward Martin, his lower torso is situated to us, so he is presented to us as is indeed his mother in the fully frontal position. And the figures are united in the background. The mirror serves repeatedly as this metaphor for spiritual sight, in which you can see the divine. It's also referred to as the image of Christ being in your soul, and seeing, as Augustine writes, not representing. So that this is not a representation, but envisioning, as Martin van Nieuwenhove does. So you can see how radically the vision of envisioning Christ, being in the presence of Christ, changes when we get to the 17th century. It's not meditation, contemplation, but much more an emphatic engagement with, which has a lot to do with religious change, the insistence on the part of the Catholic Church that the host on the altar changes into the body and blood of Christ, that interest in materiality, physical presence transformation. And that's all I'm going to say about that complicated matter. But what we have, I think you can see here, is clearly a powerful figure who is triumphing over sin, death, and the devil. Sin by the serpent, death the skull, and the devil presented by the fires of hell. Now, this was a subject derived from Protestant works, from Luther. And this is a woodcut from 1520s, which represents a whole series of, makes reference, I should say, to a whole series of biblical texts to illustrate a statement that Luther made that's not in the Bible, that Christ descended into hell and was victorious over sin, death, and the devil. So what you see is a typically Lutheran point of view, in that you are redeemed entirely by Christ's sacrifice, by grace. This is the dove of the Holy Spirit, making grace visible, the blood washing you clean, you the repentant sinner. But what we want to pay attention to here is the triumphant figure of Christ, which gets adapted by Rubens for his picture, but for a series of images before that. This one by Martin de Vos, as you can see, it says there, "For as in Adam all die," whoops, the inscription under there is, "Even so in Christ all shall be made alive." So this is really powerful imperial type imagery, emperor seated on his throne, Christ on the sarcophagus with the instrument of his victory, the cross, and the heavens open up from his body to make very clear that the life-giving properties of his flesh bridges the gap between earth and heaven. But it also still situates the subject, or I should say situates the subject within the narrative. You have the temporal earth here, the crucifixion, and then Jerusalem reference to the Holy Jerusalem in the background, but also the site of Christ's passion. Rubens must have known de Vos's print. He uses the imagery that de Vos presents there and turns it into a work in which we have an immediate encounter. We're looking at the de Vos from afar. Rubens brings us right up. He places a series of rocks here, a repoussoir, which marks the division between our space and the space of the painting. So we have an encounter with Christ in which we have embodied presence. We really are acutely aware of our being placed in front of this figure and are being placed at a certain distance from her as he still fixes us with his very compelling gaze. It's also extremely dynamic. He's in the process of being made present, we could say, by the way that the angel holds the white cloth behind him, a cloth that acts as both, makes visible the shroud and is the shroud, makes reference to the shroud being removed from the corpse of Lazarus to bring him back to life. But it also functions like a cloth of honor that's being hung behind him. And of course, very effectively serves to present him. So it's making Christ visible in a way. I mean, the pulling up of the shroud, making him visible, making visible that he is resurrected, brought back to life. The angels in the background with the crowns and palms of martyrdom, the little angels, and then the banner of victory, which is there's a red banner that is at the top of the staff that he's holding, underscoring, making very visible the activity of triumph, of resurrection, and as he looks at you, reminding you that you too shall have life. As we die in Adam, we have life in Christ. And when we come to the Ecce Homo, we come to a work that doesn't situate us so clearly. We don't have the repoussoir, we don't see the full body of Christ. Rather, we're brought up much closer to the body. And rather than seeing, as in the other works, beyond the figure, beyond a threshold to the figure, it really seems to be present in our space without defining it in the way that the Columbus picture did. Also, the way we're situated is very much by gaze. I mean, we are present, seen by Christ, seen by Pilate, and not seen by the soldier. But before I proceed with that, I need to say something about this subject. Christ is presented to the people twice, according to the Gospels. He's presented once with Barabbas, and the crowd is asked to determine who should be set free. They choose Barabbas. And then Pilate says, well, what should I do with him? And they say, crucify him. And Pilate says, I find no fault in him. And still they say, crucify him. Now, in this splendid painting by Titian, it's more spectacle, and we see the suffering Christ being presented to a rather sumptuous crowd. But the tradition is usually to show an abject Christ as he was there, but to vilify the crowd, to show them as kind of grotesque, as you can see here. Not very pleasant, calling out, shouting, crucify him, crucify him. He's bent over, his hands bowed. He's been mocked, the crown of thorns placed on his head, obviously, to mock that he was king of the Jews. To give him a reed scepter, which you don't see here, but it is in the Rubens and in some others. and then a cloth that's sort of mockingly the robe, like a royal robe. In Durer's woodcut, which is part of a series representing the Passion, which Ecce Homo serves very much a part of one of the scenes of the Passion. And you can see that Durer's done something really interesting here in terms of showing you the narrative, the crowd down below, and making clear that they're calling for crucifixion. They've got the crosses there at the left, but setting Christ up now, not on a stage, but in this, well, in a kind of stage, but it's there. That scene is like a sub-scene. You see the column against which he was flagellated before he was presented to the people. And you see Pilate, rather interestingly, making apparent, I've examined him and I don't find any fault in him. And the suffering scene relating to the Man of Sorrows. This picture by Quentin Metzais, I'm showing you primarily because you have, again, abject figure, but like the Rubens, it just cuts down 3/4 length figure. He's gotten rid of the crowds, so you can have this closer relationship with Christ, and you can start realizing that you could be to blame for this. You're making a judgment, although he does include these ghastly figures behind at the right. You can blame. Behind Christ, the column, making reference to the column against which he was flagellated, and a capital that looks very much like the crown of thorns. So it's almost as if he's there flagellated, but making a connection with the narrative involved. Like Durer, in this little excerpt, we have 3 figures, Pilate, Christ, and a soldier. And this was a common, became a common formula, as you see here in this painting by Correggio. And like all of them, prior to Rubens and after Rubens, the hands are bound in front of the body. Christ has clearly suffered. He's weak, emaciated, the crown of thorns. Here he does have the reed scepter. Rubens makes a startling transformation by showing Christ as heroic, this powerful torso that he gives Christ, and a very confident outward staring. This is not part of the tradition at all. So that torso is clearly modeled in a Roman sculpture, one that was published or printed just about the same time as Rubens made his painting. And so the scholars who have written about this have drawn the conclusion, I think quite rightly, that Rubens made this for a collector, somebody who would have been familiar with the source for the Christ. And so the centaur seems like a strange source for Christ. It's usually used to exemplify the passions and bestial side, but it's very effective to emphasize corporeality, to emphasize the body of Christ. It is Christ's flesh that enables mankind to be saved, the sacrifice of his body. Placed here directly before you, looking out powerfully at you. And Rubens engages here in the most recent article about this picture argues that what Rubens is doing here is showing the power to transform sculpture into paint. And I'm interested here, in this, which is making reference to the power of paint to transform. So we have sculptural articulation and the rhetorical side of art. Pilate here pointing at Christ, saying, behold, corresponding very much to how key text in the history of art, 1435, Alberti's De Pictura or Della Pittura on painting, that gets referred to again and again and again by artists, by writers of art, in which Alberti says, I like someone in the painting that makes contact with you and points out what's going on. Well, nobody could fit that bill more than Pilate, who's directing your attention at Christ and saying, behold. But also, what is going on here is, sorry, I keep hitting, is the role of the soldier. Christ is here in front of that column. It's almost like there's a reference to the cross. We have the column coming down, Pilate's hand pointing here, and then the soldier's hand grasping here. Anyway, fixing the figure of Christ there. The difference between those hands, I think, is compelling, pointing out what you see here, the open hand, the closed hand, a signal of the soldier not seeing. And this is something that has been overlooked in discussions of the picture, primarily because the engraver got it wrong. The engraver shows the soldier here looking out at us. So there's no distinction. But the soldier here, the light falls on the helmet, on his nose, and on one of his pupils, but he can't see. And I think it's important here to look at that helmet as a mirror. Its reflective surface making that kind of reference. And I think it's a direct reference to 1 Corinthians 13:12. We see now through a glass in a dark manner, then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. So this verse that evokes at the end of time, when the saved shall sit in the presence of God. And I think that's what Rubens is doing here, this reference to a long tradition of this eschatological end of contemplation. And this is something that Ecce does 10 years after Rubens, characterizing contemplation as a sort of presentiment of the eschatological vision of God by the action of grace. The soul is made to sense the presence of the otherwise invisible God. It sees him as if in a mirror, anticipating a sure vision of him, face to face, granted at the end of time. And I think in addition to using the mirror here to make reference to painting as a mirror, this is also a reference to this very popular text from Corinthians, reminding us that on earth now, we see as in a dark manner. We do not see clearly. We see here, as he says, the looking forth to, now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. It's the reciprocity that I'm rather clumsily getting at here, that the Pilate points to Christ. You see Christ, the corporeal Christ, emphasized with all that physicality. But the mirror indicates that you do not see the invisible God behind. That here on earth we see in a dark manner. It is only then that we will see face to face. And surely the way Christ looks at us is this extraordinary sense of reciprocity, of seeing and being seen. And it's so effective because it's Rubens' face. Rubens painted himself doing that, not because, like Rembrandt, who shows 50 self-portraits, Rubens never does. He doesn't paint self-portraits. He occasionally painted on request. But to paint that face, he has to see in a mirror. And then we get to the other aspect of mirroring, of the mirror, which is the tool in the studio, what you use as a painter. So that by looking at himself in a mirror, he creates this incredibly compelling image of seeing you, seeing into you as he sees into his eyes when he looks at the mirror. And that soldier with the helmet indicates the limited nature of corporeal seeing. So to change gears, we'll go back to Alberti, who writes in the De Pictura, painting possesses a truly divine power that not only does it make the absent present, but it represents the dead to the living, and goes on from that. Makes the absent present. This feature of portraiture that is so important, as Alberti says, represents the dead to the living. If we look at Rembrandt's representation of Nicholas Rutz from 1631, we have similar 3/4 length representation, but everything else radically different. This is a work that stresses the mimetic quality of painting. There's no idealization, no looking to past works of art. This is descriptive, mimetic depiction of the fur merchant, Nicholas Rutz. Rembrandt gave him 3 types of fur on this outfit to, as it were, advertise his trade. I think it's mink on this part, rabbit on this part, and a sable hat. But unfortunately, I don't have good details of the fur, which would make it make clear the tactility of this picture, the desire to touch the painting. But you have a representation that really makes us feel, I think, that we're in the presence of an individual. But he doesn't have a sense of presence in the way that Christ does, this powerful, overriding, pushing into our space. It's a more passive representation, and one that gives you the sense of a striking fidelity in recording the feature of Nicholas Rutz. I chose the portrait of Rutz primarily because of the extraordinary mimetic aspect, the fidelity of texture being represented, to play against the 1654 portrait of Jan VI, in which we have a work of, I think, extraordinary presence, but one that is very much the beholder's share. It is not structured the way that the Rubens was, not fixing you at a particular place, but rather presenting a man who seems temporarily lost in thought, not looking out at the world confidently, but pausing. I'm showing you this work of Kröll, Jan Hermansen Kröll, because it has the same kind of mimetic aspect of costume that's so important. If you're having your portrait painting, you want your outfit to be properly rendered, but also because you have a reference here to a threshold, to a space beyond. 6 seems to have, according to the art historians who discuss the painting, seems to have paused on its way to go out. Unless, I mean, that I think is apparent, that he's in the process of putting on his gloves. So we can say that that's a fair interpretation. But there's a good deal of disagreement about the rest of what's going on here. I'm totally convinced of my interpretation that this is a contemplative figure lost in thought. Svetlana Alpers, a great historian of Dutch art, sees it as a resistant figure, in part because of the combative history to some extent between Rembrandt and the patron Jan VI. They're close friends. Rembrandt sold some paintings to him. He gave 2 drawings in his friendship album, made an etching, as we'll see in a moment. But there seems to have been some disagreement about how Six wanted himself to be portrayed. These are the drawings related to the etching that I'm going to show you in a minute. This one here in red chalk has something of the same, I think, unfocused gaze. Certainly someone who's so inwardly focused that he's not paying any attention to his dog, that clearly wants to go for a walk. Then we see him reading instead. And this is the etching that was completed at the end of those drawings, that very much shows Six defined by his environment, by the objects. So a painting here to attest to the fact that he's a very important collector, a pile of manuscripts here, an extremely literate and learned individual, a huge ceremonial sword with this strap that wears to show he's a civic guard, part of public function, but that's laid aside now, and he's engaged in reading, to a certain extent turning his back on the world. So when we come to the painting of Jan VI, all that paraphernalia is gone. It's just Six himself in this ambiguous ground, and no clear relationship to us, general relationship in our space, but an independence, I think, due to the contemplative mind. But what predominates, well, that's maybe too strong. What certainly makes itself known is this is a painting. And the way that it is painted is remarkable and striking and totally different. Well, totally, again, too strong. Very different from Rembrandt's normal manner of painting. I don't think there's another picture painting where you have wet on wet pigment. It's alla prima, just streaking the yellow that's supposed to show the gold braid into the red. We're aware of how rapidly it has been painted. I should have pointed out when I showed you the other images of Nicholas Rutz and Jan Harmensen Kroll, they're all in sober black. That's what you wear for public. This costume had been interpreted as sort of Six wanting to be aristocratic, but further research shows this is actually a riding costume. He purchased a country estate. He is presumably going out for a ride, which accounts for the unusual, less than sober costume. Six was, as I said, a cultivated individual. The Dutch translation of Castiglione's The Courtier was dedicated to him. And much has been written recently about the manner of execution being Rembrandt imitating what Castiglione refers to as sprezzatura. A courtier should do something with apparent effortlessness, be accomplished and learned, and bear his accomplishments lightly. Apparently, Castiglione specifically relates it to looseness in painting, this sort of freedom of execution. So it could show Rembrandt here now accommodating very definitely Six's gentlemanly ideal. But it has also been suggested by Alpers, who says Rembrandt painted it so quickly because Six was about to get away, that Six had had it with all the sittings that he needed to do for or the posing that he needed to do for the Ecce. And so by necessity, he had to paint the picture quickly, and she interprets Six facial expression. Not so much the expression, the downturned head as I'm done with this, I'm moving on, I'm not looking at it. This is the beholder's share. We each engage our imagination as we see fit. So this was contrast in the black with the. Sometimes this picture of Jakob Tripp has been mentioned in a contrast. It was done somewhat later, the Jan 6 of 1654. And statesmen made that, well, Rembrandt liked to sometimes dress up his sitters. Not very often. But a kind of robe that lends itself to a fanciful engagement with the picture. Apparently, Jakob Tripp is wearing a nightcap, and this is some kind of house coat, as it were. Well, I must say I have a little trouble with how that relates to this quite splendid cane he's holding and the chair in which he's sitting. I think he looks like a powerful patriarch, ascetic, but definitely a forceful individual, seated almost as if with a scepter. So again, the beholder's share, how we each relate to this, is something that Rembrandt makes possible in the way that he paints the pictures. So I think there you can see the rather splendid staff and patriarchal in terms of age, and I read that as a turban. But this is gloriously painted. If I could have a painting, I think it might be this one. Even though it would be hard to live with a presence, which to me is as potent as that one, I might not want. But I think he's got a wonderful, thoughtful, ruminative face. And the way that the hands are painted, this, this way that the pigment reads as pigment, flat canvas, and then starts curving up, and then creates this extraordinary three-dimensional space, and then drags a brush across to create this sense of, I'm done. I got 5-minute grace period. To create this sense of gold or trim, and the pigment just stroked on, underscoring the canvas, the flatness. And I think that hand's a miracle, that you see the small bones, you get the articulation of the hand, and then the streak of paint here. So I guess in terms of presence, Jan 6 is present to me as a sentient, thinking human being, but also present as a painting, that the painting itself has a remarkable presence. And with that, I am going to, oh, this. Well, this is definitely presence of pigment as well as an extraordinary presentation of fugitive emotion and, well, that's not right, not fugitive, but poignant feeling and incredible surface. One art historian says it looks as if it came into being by geological formation. Rembrandt normally works his canvases a lot, which is at the late stage when he painted Jan 6, which is why Jan 6 is so radically different. This is a very large picture. The figures are almost life-size. And so we'll leave the thickness of Rembrandt's paint to Rothko, who is an artist whose paintings have really powerful presence for me. And it's not like that's my assessment. That's how I respond to them, but they are talked about repeatedly as having this presence, the spatial. This one, I must say, it looks as if something is looking at you from the other side, but mainly it's the blending of the pigment that if you stand in front of many Rothkos and take the time to really look at them, they seem alive. They seem to breathe. But it really is the beholder's share. You really need to engage with them. This one is in Chicago, and I found it particularly striking. You look at the way the pigment bleeds out and through, and I think you could understand why, when asked why he didn't put frames around his canvases, Rothko said, well, that would be like putting them in coffins. He really felt that they had presence, and I would agree. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll take questions if you have any. Yes? Yeah. Thanks, Katie.
Painting of Jan 6, because the 6 family has owned the same house in its years. I have strong feeling that painting still in their house happened to be in Amsterdam and just applied to go and see the collection.
Unfortunately, that's no longer true. It's really sad. They've closed the collection. You used to go present your passport at the Rijksmuseum, get a special pass, go in the collection. I hope it's a temporary thing, because it really is a remarkable collection. And as you point out, they've had it all that time, which accounts for the extraordinarily good condition that the painting is in, that it stayed in one family. It has traveled, but to an exhibition or two, but not very much. So let's hope the 6s are going to change their mind.
Can you go back to the Ecce Homo by Rubens?
Jackie will have to help me do that. In the meantime, can you give me your question and I'll start answering?
Well, the question I have is, it seems like his the facial expression is so inappropriate.
Christ's or Pilate's?
Yeah, Christ. And we won't even talk about the body. The body is totally inappropriate. But I don't know if Rubens had a message in that. I think you commented on it.
I'm not sure what you mean by the body as inappropriate. Is hugely
Yeah.
do I need to do something, Jackie?
No. Well, the facial expression isn't one of pain or sorrow or anything like that.
No,
The
no.
facial expression reminds you of somebody who just underwent the halftime of a Buckeye game. You know, instead of anguish.
Oh, shoot. I thought I could get a single view, but let's just leave it.
Yeah.
No, it's, I wanted to indicate that it was, Rubens was painting this with the aim of making Christ present to you. And this idea of seeing Christ within and to conform to Christ by living a more virtuous life, polishing, as Augustine says, the image of Christ in your soul. But it is a gaze that does, I think, work with the Corinthians statement that I chose to relate to. We see now in a dark manner, then face to face, and I will be known even as I am known. This notion of he's scrutinizing to paint his self-portrait. He's scrutinizing himself in the mirror, and I think that does indeed come across. And I was reading it in relationship to his role later as a judge, when you, the soul, will see him face to face and be known. So I can see that you find, I agree with you, it's not like the others we looked at. He doesn't look like he's suffering. Yes. Well, Jan 6 was done on commission. He had his portrait painted. We don't know who Rubens painted that for, but Rubens didn't hang out much in the studio. I mean, he traveled a lot, he drew a lot, he went on diplomatic missions, but I shouldn't have said he spent a lot of time in the studio. But he was commissioned constantly. So Rembrandt painted on spec at the beginning of his career. He took portrait commissions so that people would come in his studio to see what he really wanted to paint. But that has a lot to do with the different situation in the Dutch Republic, artistic situation. Rubens was a devout Catholic, so lots of church commissions, lots of commissions from religious orders, knighted 3 times, the King of Spain, the King of England, and temporary blockage there. Anyway, he he had lots of commissions. He had, oh, the King of France, my goodness, he had a huge Marie de Medici cycle, 22 paintings, giant. They're in the Louvre. Nobody's tried to steal them yet. Yes?
Would these have been painted with a model, actually, a human being, to replicate what Rubens was finally painting or not?
Well,
Or was it all in his mind?
he based this, as I said, on that centaur, but Rubens was a stickler for painting flesh. So he, in some cases, posed live models to imitate the sculpture. By this point, I don't think he did that for him. He would not have painted 3 figures together. That wouldn't have been a mock-up. No, and he had a studio book where he drew from that head. Now, I did a face like this. I can manipulate it for that.
So was there a drawing then before he made the painting?
Not of the whole painting. Rubens did drawings of individuals, individual portions, and he did wholesale copies. He did 18 copies of pictures by Titian when he was in Madrid waiting for the King of Spain to decide whether he was going to send him to England on a diplomatic mission. He's constantly working, but with the brush. There's scads of drawings, but what exists for this, prior to this, is an oil sketch. So he sketched it out in oil before he then decided to do a finished painting. Yeah. Ellen, the oil sketch is pretty free. I don't think it would be discernible as his face. It's only fairly recently that the curators in the Hermitage, which is where it is in St. Petersburg, said, it really is. The statements came out. Is it his face? Isn't it his face? You look at it in relation to the few self-portraits, it is his face, but it isn't a self-portrait. He's doing it to get the gaze right. So my recollection of the sketch in 30 years since I saw it, I don't know. If you send me an email, I'll get back to you. But I'm guessing not, because the sketches are not sufficiently defined for you to be able to recognize it as a face, as his face, I mean. I should say I'm happy to keep answering questions, but anybody who wants to go, please feel free to depart.
This is fabulous. Remember recently the Columbus Museum of Art made an entire exhibition out of the Caravaggio Ecce Homo from Genoa. And we know that Rubens spent a lot of time in Genoa. Is there any correlation between Rubens and Caravaggio?
There's lots of correlation in Rubens' early work. He spent a lot of time looking at Caravaggio. Mm-hmm. That curious Caravaggio from Genoa, which it took Lorenzo Pericolo some time to convince me that, yeah, maybe it really could be a Caravaggio. It's an odd picture, and I wouldn't see a connection with Rubens there.
I think the one thing that interests me, as you did such a nice job explaining the relationships of the two characters presenting Christ, is that in that Caravaggio version, you have him really being presented. And when you did the demonstration of the windows in the earlier part of your talk, figures outside looking in and the way the window holds the subject in a particular way to present it, you have that in the supposed Caravaggio Ecce Homo, where the figure in black in the foreground steps out of the time of Christ and is presenting Christ back to you. And it's so interesting how Pilate here is behind Christ instead, and the presentation of him is a totally different message, as you pointed out.
Yeah, that Pilate in the Caravaggio is a curious figure and theatrical in many ways, and but most of the representations of Pilate are more like the Rubens than like the Caravaggio. Yeah.
Of course, when we look at art, we recognize, or the common view is, I think, nowadays, that there's an interaction between the painter and the observer, and that the art takes place in this kind of mutual relationship. Do we know how Rubens felt about that? When Rubens was painting, do we have any idea about whether people were painting at that time also felt that the essence of the painting was not only what they were presenting on the canvas, but the reaction of human beings who would be seeing that canvas?
Well, I think that that's hard to say in terms of like the run through I gave of the 15th century meditational. Yeah, very much an awareness of what the role of art was, or the role of and it would depend on the function. Like the Rubens picture in our museum is most likely an epitaph. So it would have been in a church, and it was a totally fitting subject for an epitaph, a promise of resurrection. In terms of how people were thinking, and lots of things I think were more fixed. When you got to private collections, then and you have correspondence from the patrons in some cases. But an awareness that anyone can make of it what they will, no. I don't think that there were too many strictures about how it was displayed, what it was intended to be, and certainly with an artist like Rubens, you're kind of manipulated.
So you're probably going to know what I'm going to ask about. Do you find this at all an erotic picture? And if so, is that just something that's totally fortuitous, or would there be any rationale for having such a hot Jesus?
Well, I will say that I won't bother to, but if you go to the engraving has sort of erased Christ's loincloth. The bulge is gone. Christ's manhood was super important to proving that he was man and God. So that Jesus that Martin van Nieuwenhove is looking at, his body is turned to you, showing his genitals. So that on a purely human level of corporeality, physicality, Christ as man. I don't know where to go with the erotic part of it.
So this is kind of a technical question. If you look at these two paintings, I'm a photographer, so I'm going to look at this from a slightly different view. If you look at these two paintings and you see the draping that's around the groin area, they're very different colors. The one on the left is kind of orangish, and the one on the right has a slight bluish tint to it. And in photography, it's really important to get the right lighting because the colors of things change. So when these photographs are made of these paintings and then handed down and looked at again and again, how do you know that they're actually representing the colors that they really are in the painting?
Well, having seen this picture face to face innumerable times, I can attest that all the photographs are terrible in terms of color. I wrote an article on that one, and getting something to give a talk there. they're really not good. That picture is also not in particularly good condition. I will say that this image is way too orange. And part of that is also you take a really good image and you project it, and whoa, I didn't think that's what it looked like. So the image I have of this is better than that in terms of color. It's not nearly so yellow. So no, it's a huge problem. If you're a photographer, you must know all about that if you take photograph and then project it. Okay.
That's color temperature in the photography, and that's so.
Yeah.
I have a question that's related ambient lighting. Weekend in DC, and they have an entire room of Rothkos, and the lighting there was very, very dim, and it was done on purpose. But could you comment on how lighting, ambient lighting, can affect the way what we perceive of a painting?
Oh, a huge difference of the effect of lighting. I was at an exhibit at a conference in Baltimore Museum of Art, and the curator from the Met who'd lent one of the pictures came up and said, "You've got the lighting all wrong. You've got the lighting all wrong. You're wrecking our painting." I wouldn't wade into that. I think it's extremely difficult. Lisa's nodding her head about the Rothkos and the Phillips collection. I don't know about the painting durability. Are they like that they need to more for effect? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your help. I ended up having fun.